Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figure It Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today I want to talk a little bit about Sega history and very particularly the concept of Sega Mini Consoles. Before we do that though, if you guys could do me a favor, please like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, as well as check out all my social media stuff in the description. I've got Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon. I also have Spreadshirt. I have my travel channel called Flying and Eating. Whole lot of stuff going on. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Now, yes, let's talk about some Sega console history. So, a lot of rumors have been persisting for years about the idea of, where is my Sega Saturn Mini? Where is my Sega Dreamcast Mini? And I'm here today to basically, rather than clickbait you into being like, ooh, I want to actually tell you why it's probably not happening anytime soon, and I'm sorry to break your hearts. Before we do that, little history lesson. So Sega, obviously, like a lot of the other video game companies, a few years ago got into the whole mini console boom. Nintendo started that by making the NES Mini and the SNES Mini, which were really just products birthed of the fact that the Nintendo Wii U was unsuccessful and they needed something. Other companies got on board, some that really surprised us, like Konami, who now had the rights to the PC Engine and TurboGrafx-16, suddenly had the PC Engine and TurboGrafx-16 Mini. That was cool. There was a few others, and obviously Sony came out with the PlayStation 1 Mini, which was not very well done, but it did come out all the same. Sega got on board. I was actually there when this was announced. Sega had brought me out to Japan for Sega Fest 2018. I actually still have the badge for it right there. And they stood up on stage and announced the Sega Mega Drive Mini or Sega Genesis Mini Model 1. They were just doing the same thing everybody was doing. Now the question here wasn't why did they pick that. That was kind of the question in Japan, but we'll talk about that in a second. All the same, they did release it, and ultimately it's right here. As you can see, mine has like some additional little bits. It's got the Mega Drive, cartridge of Sonic 2 and Sonic and Knuckles, as well as a fake Sega CD. But this came out, really, those are just cosmetic. They don't do anything. It's ultimately, it's a little piece of hardware that has an emulator built onto it, running Sega Genesis games with, certain optimization. And people just wanted it for the nostalgia berries. You wanted to be able to play those awesome Sega Genesis history, memories, but in a more modern setup. And, Sega actually sent this to me for free for the purpose of review years ago. I made a video about it. You can obviously go see it. I loved it. I thought it was really neat. And the idea that Sega was making, hey, it's technically some Sega hardware. That's cool. So where were they going to go after that? Now, personally, I didn't think they were really going to release anything else. Now, to be fair, I was technically wrong about that. They ultimately did do that Astrocade one, which isn't really a console, obviously. They technically did some Game Gear ones, which that one was just kind of like for fun. That only came out in Japan, was really intended for kids, and a lot of people got mad because they were like, this isn't a good one. It's not a big screen with a whole bunch of games. It's like, yeah, because it's not meant for you. It's meant for little kids. It's only supposed to have like 4 games. It's only supposed to... Doesn't matter. But eventually they did do a second iteration, which is seen here. Again, Sega sent me this. I did a video on it. This is an upgraded version where it still plays Sega Genesis games based on the Model 2 design, but it also had Sega CD support. A few titles such as Sonic CD were on there. And again, they released these little plastic kits, like this is a 32X and a copy of Virtua Racing, and the Sega CD itself, which actually has a functional disk drive, which is pretty neat. Functional in the sense that it opens. It doesn't actually do anything. But that was like the most we got out of them, was an upgraded version of the Genesis. Again, why not other systems? And by the way, I don't think they're ever going to do a 32X. I'm actually a little surprised this didn't natively support 32X. I guess I would say it's not impossible we'll get another iteration of the Genesis in some form. Maybe they just use the Sega CDX model or something, then have it support 32X capabilities or something. Who knows? Who knows? Who knows? Or wouldn't that be neat if they chose the Neptune model? That'd be cool. Don't expect it. But anyway... that's not impossible. They'll re-release the Sega Genesis forever. But the question is, why that? Why is it always that? Well, in order to understand that, you need to know the Sega timeline. I'm pointing not at my obesity, but I'm pointing at the t-shirt and the fact that it has a whole bunch of Sega consoles on it. So, if you grew up in the United States or Canada, and you probably were under the impression that the Sega Genesis was the first system that Sega ever made. No, therein lies the entire problem. They had a system before that in North America called the Sega Master System. and it failed horribly. In fact, here it is. I have the Model 2, the North American Model 2 of it, which I just have the oddball versions out here because I'm a hipster. So that's the Model 2 Sega Master System, the Korean Samsung Sega Saturn, and the Japanese Resident Evil Claire Edition Dreamcast for the pretties. But yeah, this system came out before the Sega Genesis, and while it was a massive success in Europe, it was a huge failure here. But at least it came out here. Unlike its predecessor, the Sega SG-1000, which really only came out in Japan and had a sparse release in a couple of countries like New Zealand and Italy. It was odd. But point is, no one thought, oh, the first system that they'll start with will be the Sega SG-1000. They didn't have the advantage Nintendo had of just doing it linearly. Why did they start with the Sega Genesis? Simple answer is that's the only system people have nostalgia for that Sega made, at least on a global level. And even that is kind of debatable, but yeah. So the thing with the NES is it was a massive success in Japan as the Famicom. It was a massive success in North America as the NES. Now, it didn't actually have that great of a lifespan in Europe, but it didn't need it compared, because the other two major regions, it did fine. That same logic would ultimately apply to the Sega Genesis. It was a massive hit in North America. It was a massive hit in Europe. But people forget or don't know, it was actually a flop in Japan. It came in pretty much dead last. In fact, I've been to Japan 20 times. 20 times. The amount of time, I can count on a hand how many times I've actually seen a Mega Drive for sale that wasn't behind glass, because it's such an odd thing to actually see over there. Weird, right? That's just how it is. So, well, then what do we do? What's our plan here? What's the alternative? How do we make another Sega Mini console? What's the best choice? Well, to completely keep it real with you, you only have 3 choices, and each one of them has a massive flaw. They're never doing a Sega SG-1000 Mini. I know that there was kind of a joke about that a little while ago, but that's never going to happen. That was just whatever. The Sega Master System is the first one that has any sort of real chance. And if you ask me, this was actually the horse to bet on, even though it's like the least interesting one. And I say that as an American. I apologize to all the Europeans. But the reason for that is simple. This system was not successful in North America at all. It was not successful in Japan either. Originally as the Sega Mark III, then turned into the Master System, and over there it sold a bit, but nothing amazing. Over here, we've already discussed it. In Europe, this was a juggernaut success. This destroyed the NES in Europe, especially in the UK. So that's good, because that's at least one continent that has nostalgia for this thing. The other advantage that it has is that it also is super comically easy to emulate at this point. It's a nothing. They could do that in their sleep. Also, it did very well in South America, and fun fact, is still active in Brazil, making it the longest run video game console in history, which is interesting all the same. Point is, if you're going to get a mini console of this particular system, it's really only coming out in Europe in a wide release, especially the UK. I could only really see it come. It would come out in Japan, repackaged as a Mark III, I would imagine. Probably sold at retail and be kind of a hard one to find, but I imagine they would do it just because that's how the Japanese are. Hey, we can't have anything that's not, also, if Sega's going to release something, which is a Japanese company, we need to have it too, because we're Japan. Even if we don't care about it, we need to have it. That's kind of how they function. North America, the only chance I see them releasing that here would be something extremely limited, like through limited run games, kind of like they did with the Astrocades or whatever. I think that's the only way you get that. But the problem with that one is that there's just not a lot of people calling for it. Like, if you look online, like, everybody's asking for Saturn Mini or Dreamcast Mini, almost nobody ever brings that up, which is ironic because it's the one that has the best shot. So that eliminates that. Moving on, we're obviously skipping the 32X and all that, but we'll move on to the Sega Saturn. This one is in constant demand by diehards, myself included. The problem with it is, again, regional success. This thing's reputation is that was a flop in North America, because it was. It was a flop in Europe as well. But people forget it actually did stupid well in Japan, beating the N64. It was actually a big hit there. The Japanese, by far, have the best chance of any sort of release of this. But then you run into the same problem. Well, that's only one of the 3 markets. What do you do in the other 2 if you're going to put all that effort into R&D? Do you even release it there? And if you do, you probably have to do it as like a limited run games type of thing. I just don't think the market exists for a Saturn to be sold like on retail shelves in North America or Europe at this point. Sorry, I'm not alone in that. I mean, clearly Sega thinks the same thing. But the other problem with it is the emulation factor. The Sega Saturn was a famously complicated machine, and emulating it to this day proves to be a pain. Now, it's not obviously impossible to get like some high-end gaming rig and actually emulate the system, sure. But if you want to get into a nice, cheap form factor, that's proving difficult. It would be easier for Sega, theoretically, because they have the source code for these games, right? Sadly, a lot of them have been lost. Therefore, they have to just use the same emulation tactics that most people would have to try and do. So to actually sell that as a quality product gets very complicated very quickly. And you're doing all that in service of a product you don't really have much market faith in outside of just one country, in this case, of course, Japan. That explains the Saturn's problems, as neat as it would be. Now you get to the Dreamcast. By the time Sega was making the Dreamcast, they needed to unify, because they were like, we're having one, like the Master System was huge in Europe, nobody else cared about it. The Genesis was huge in North America, the other regions didn't really care as much about it. Europe did to an extent, but 32X and Sega CD people didn't really care about. Saturn, Japan only cared about. We need a system that everybody will care about. That's how you get to the Dreamcast. Now, I would argue that they were somewhat successful in that. I would think all 3 of those regions actually do care about the Dreamcast. There's nostalgia for all of them. That is a huge factor, by the way. You have to, in order to have a mini console be successful, there has to be a base, because they entirely capitalize on nostalgia. There has to be a base that is nostalgic. That's why the Genesis worked, and why the Master System outside of Europe likely would not. That's a point you need to accept. With the Dreamcast, that exists. That is a huge tactical advantage for its potential release, which is great. The problem here, well, okay, the other element of it, it's not insanely complicated like the Saturn. So it does seem, like viable to produce. The source code is not, all the games aren't like lost. So what's stopping it? Technology. So here's the thing. Form factor. If you want to get this into a little mini box like this, you really only have 2 ways to do it. You either essentially build like this amazing, perfect Dreamcast, emulator from the ground up that you actually replicate hardware for and have like perfect running games on it, or you do kind of a, low-end version that's just kind of running PC ports. Now you might think I'm kind of pulling that out of my butt, but here's the thing. I was working with Sega for a little while there, and I remember having a call with them around one of the times of the Shenmue re-release. And on the call, they were telling me, like, hey, because they were picking my brain about Dreamcast stuff, because they started doing a whole bunch of digital Dreamcast re-releases. And they were like, what do you think about the idea of doing it that way as opposed to, like, a mini box? And I was like, well, what's the issue with the mini version? And they were like, the problem, honestly, is that basically, if we want to release it as a console, and this was a few years ago, so things have changed, I'm sure. But if we want to release it as a console, it's going to be like $300. Because we need to put like real hardware in it, and the technology is just not cheap enough yet to actually do that. Nobody would be happy with a $300 price tag. People would be expecting $100, so everybody would be mad. So you get a high quality product that's just that prices too many people out. Or they said that you could do PC versions, because a lot of the games were actually converted back to PC in the day. Sonic Adventure, Crazy Taxi. In fact, that Xbox 360 collection that came out like however many years ago of the Dreamcast collection was all PC conversions. And nobody liked it because they were like, well, this isn't really the Dreamcast versions of any of the games. It's just, you just did the easy thing. They said, yeah, we can make it cheaper and just kind of do that. Shenmue now would be applicable for that as well because they now have converted it to PC. But they were like, you either get the cheap, affordable one that's not a great product, or you get the great product one that's not affordable. Hence, it has not been released. I mean, if you think about it, the whole mini thing is kind of over anyway. People still kind of want it at least as an idea. But if you look at all the consoles that have had mini iterations, the most capable machine that was replicated was the PS1. And Sony did a really bad job of it. You're asking Sega to do a lot more in a lot shorter of a time frame, relatively speaking, for the emulation technology and affordability to catch up. So, where I leave you in all of this is to say that None of them are impossible. They're all just really unlikely for a series of unfortunate reasons, all of which mostly go back to the fact that none of them were huge hits to begin with. If the Master System had been a big, global hit to begin with, yeah, they would have done it. No problem. But because it wasn't, there's really only one area of the planet where it actually makes sense to do that. And is that worth the R&D? They apparently don't think so. The Sega Saturn, same problem. Like, now you've got the R&D problem on top of the fact that it's only good in just one country instead of a whole continent of countries. And the Dreamcast, well, has the global reach. The technology is just not there. So I don't think, personally, Sega is going to be making another mini console anytime soon unless it's yet another iteration of the Genesis, this time probably with some 32X support, maybe to hold people over, although this is just kind of obviously just a thought, but that would be my guess. Maybe eventually you can get a Dreamcast Mini. I think that's the one that people want the most, but it's not happening anytime soon. It's going to be at least a few years. Saturn, I'm sad to say, I think they're just going to skip it. Master System, I think if there was enough of an online push for that, you could actually get that one. I think that one's realistic. But every time I see somebody talking about this, these are the only two they're talking about. Nobody ever brings this up. Maybe a few people in the UK here and there, but that's it. So petition, petition, petition if you want that. I think that's your best bet. So, that'll pretty much do it. Those are my thoughts. Thank you guys very much for watching. If you guys could do me a favor, please like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, as well as check out all the social media stuff in the description. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, etc. Spreadshirt is available. My travel channel is available, Flying and Eating. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all later.